Me and my crew of the Velvet Underworld channels would really love to hear how things are going on at your place, or you could share it to the comment sections so that we could connect with each other. Uh, we would love to build a community of people who love touching stories about mafia bosses. Now, let's enjoy today's stories, shall we?
The most dangerous man in Chicago was completely powerless, not against the FBI and not against a rival syndicate. He was powerless against his 4-year-old son's deafening screams in a crowded 5-star restaurant. Every bodyguard froze. Every patron held their breath. But one waitress didn't care about the mob. She just saw a broken boy. Il Sapor was the kind of restaurant where breathing too loudly felt like a faux pas. At $300 a plate, the Chicago elite paid for ambiance, exclusivity, and utter discretion. Sienna Hayes, a 24-year-old waitress drowning in her younger sister's medical debt, usually kept her head down, poured the imported Barolo, and blended into the expensive wallpaper. But tonight, the atmosphere in the dining room didn't just chill, it plummeted to absolute zero. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, and in walked Titus Costa. Even if you didn't know he was the ruthless head of the Costa crime family, the aura of violence surrounding him was suffocating. He was a tall, sharply dressed man in a bespoke charcoal suit, his jawline carved from granite, and his eyes a dead, unforgiving onyx. Flanking him were 4 men who bulged out of their tailored jackets, men who looked like they broke bones for cardio. But it was the small, trembling figure holding Titus's hand that caught Sienna's eye. It was a little boy, no older than 4. His name was Leo. He wore a miniature suit that looked impossibly stiff and uncomfortable. He looked terrified, exhausted, and desperately small in a world of giants. "Put them at the corner booth. Clear the tables around them," Mr. Sterling, the restaurant manager, hissed into Sienna's ear, his face pale with sweat. "And for God's sake, Sienna, do not look Costa in the eye." For the first 20 minutes, it was quiet. The bodyguards stood like gargoyles. Titus sat rigidly, cutting his steak, occasionally murmuring something in sharp Italian to the man on his right, a scar-faced brute named Carmine. Then, the murmuring stopped. It started as a whimper. Little Leo dropped his silver fork, the clatter echoing off the marble floors. Titus sighed, a harsh, impatient sound, and gestured for a bodyguard to pick it up. The massive man leaned over, his gun briefly visible under his jacket, and shoved a new fork toward the boy. Leo shrank back, his breathing hitching. He didn't want the fork. He pushed his plate away, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The glass shattered, the sound slicing through the dead silence of the restaurant. "Leo!" "Basta," Titus snapped, his voice low but vibrating with dark authority. "Enough." But it wasn't a tantrum. Sienna, watching from the wait station with a tray of empty glasses, knew a panic attack when she saw one. The boy's chest was heaving. His tiny hands flew to his ears, and he let out a shriek that shattered the quiet elegance of Il Sapor. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. The other patrons openly stared, though they quickly averted their eyes when Carmine glared in their direction. Titus's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. He was a man who commanded thousands of men, a man who could silence a room with a whisper, but he had no idea what to do with a hysterical child. "Get him quiet," Titus growled to one of his men. A bodyguard named Rocco reached out, clumsily grabbing the boy's shoulder. "Hey, kid, come on, you're embarrassing your old man." Leo screamed louder, thrashing wildly, knocking a bread basket off the table. He slid out of the booth and curled into a tight ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Titus stood up, furious, embarrassed, and entirely out of his depth. "Pick him up, we are leaving." Rocco reached down, his massive hands roughly grabbing the boy's arms to haul him to his feet. Sienna didn't think. She just reacted. "Let him go." The words ripped out of her throat before she could stop them. The entire restaurant gasped. Mr. Sterling looked like he was about to pass out. Every single bodyguard's hand dropped to their holster. Carmine stepped forward, blocking Titus, his eyes locked on Sienna like a predator. Titus Costa turned slowly. His gaze hit Sienna, and it felt like physical pressure against her chest. "Excuse me?" he asked softly. Too softly. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't stop walking. She moved past Carmine, ignoring the terrifying proximity of men who killed for a living, and dropped to her knees right there on the floor next to Leo. "Don't touch him like that," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Looking up at the bodyguard, she turned her attention to the sobbing boy. He was hyperventilating, his face red, his eyes squeezed shut. "Get away from my son," Titus warned, taking a step forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Costa," Sienna said, finally looking the mob boss in the eye, "your men are terrifying him. The lights are too bright, the noise is too loud, and he's overwhelmed." She didn't wait for his permission. Sienna ignored the guns, the threats, and the power in the room. She began to hum softly, a low, steady lullaby her mother used to sing. She kept her hands visible and slowly laid one on the floor near Leo's head, not touching him, just letting him know she was there. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice a stark contrast to the rough baritones of the Mafia men. "It's really loud in here, isn't it? It's okay, you're safe." Slowly, incredibly, the shrieking downgraded to hiccups. Leo peeked through his fingers. He saw Sienna's gentle, empathetic face. "You don't have to be a big boy right now," she murmured. "It's okay to cry." Leo let out a broken sob and, to the absolute shock of everyone in the room, uncurled his body and threw his arms around Sienna's neck, burying his wet face into her apron. Sienna wrapped her arms around him, rocking him gently on the floor of the five-star restaurant, whispering soothing words into his hair. Titus stood frozen. The imposing Mafia boss looked completely stunned. For months, his son hadn't let anyone touch him. He had been a shell of a child since his mother's death. Yet here he was, clinging to a stranger. Sienna looked up over the boy's shoulder, meeting Titus's cold, calculating eyes. "He doesn't need discipline, Mr. Costa," Sienna said quietly, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "He doesn't need bodyguards or expensive dinners. He just needs a mom." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmine looked ready to pull his weapon for the sheer disrespect, but Titus just stared at Sienna. Something dark, complex, and deeply dangerous shifted in his expression. "Carmine," Titus finally said, his voice void of emotion. "Get the car." Titus reached down, taking his son from Sienna's arms. Leo whimpered but didn't fight his father. Titus looked at Sienna one last time, tossing a thick stack of $100 bills onto the table, enough to cover the meal and a small car. "What is your name?" Titus asked. "Sienna," she replied, standing up, suddenly realizing the gravity of what she had just done. Titus didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, the darkness swallowing him and his men, leaving Il Sapor in stunned silence. Sienna thought she had just survived the most terrifying encounter of her life. She didn't know it was only the beginning. 3 days later, Sienna's life as she knew it ceased to exist. It started subtly. She noticed a black SUV parked across from her cramped, second-story apartment in the rougher part of the city. Then, the eviction notice she had been dreading for months miraculously vanished. Her landlord nervously told her that her rent was handled for the next 5 years. Most shockingly, the hospital called to inform her that her sister's mounting dialysis bills had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. Sienna wasn't stupid. She knew there was only one man in Chicago who operated with that kind of sweeping, terrifying wealth. On Thursday evening, as she stepped out of the pouring rain and into her apartment building's lobby, she wasn't alone. Carmine was leaning against the peeling wallpaper, smoking a cigarette, looking wildly out of place in his $1,000 suit. "Miss Hayes," Carmine said, his voice like gravel. "The boss wants a word." 10 minutes later, Sienna was sitting in the back of a blacked-out Lincoln Navigator, speeding toward the Gold Coast. She was escorted through the wrought iron gates of a sprawling, fortress-like estate. Security cameras tracked their every move. Armed men patrolled the perimeter with dogs. She was led into a massive study lined with dark wood and leather. Titus Costa stood by the window, pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't turn around when she entered. "You paid my sister's medical bills," Sienna started, refusing to let her voice shake. "And my rent." "Why?" Titus turned, taking a sip of his scotch. "I don't like to owe debts, Sienna. You helped my son. I helped your family. I didn't do it for a reward. I want to pay you back." A humorless smile ghosted across Titus's lips. "You couldn't afford to pay me back if you worked at that restaurant for 3 lifetimes. But as it happens, you don't work there anymore." Sienna froze. "What?" "I bought Il Sapore this morning," Titus stated casually, walking toward his massive mahogany desk. "I fired Sterling. He was an idiot. And I took you off the payroll." Panic seized her chest. "You can't do that. I need that job." "You have a new job," Titus interrupted, his voice dropping to a tone that brokered zero argument. He leaned against the desk, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Leo hasn't slept in 3 days. He hasn't spoken a word since my wife died 6 months ago. But since Tuesday night, he has been walking to the front door, pointing at it, and crying for the woman from the restaurant." Titus stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "I have hired the best child psychologists in the country. I have hired British nannies, pediatricians, specialists. He bites them, screams at them, or ignores them. But he wants you." "I'm not a nanny, Mr. Costa. I'm a waitress." "You were a waitress," Titus corrected smoothly. "Now, you are Leo's primary caregiver. You will move into this house. You will have your own wing. You will be paid $50,000 a month. Your sister will continue to receive the best medical care money can buy." Sienna stared at him in horror. It was a gilded cage. "And if I say no?" Titus's eyes turned entirely cold. The mask of a concerned father vanished, replaced by the dawn of the Costa Syndicate. "You don't say no to me, Sienna. I own your apartment building. I own your sister's medical debt. I own the restaurant you worked at. You will pack your bags, and you will be back here by tomorrow morning. Or I will simply undo all the generosity I've bestowed upon you." It wasn't an offer. It was an extortion. The next morning, Sienna moved into the Costa estate. Her wing was larger than any house she had ever lived in, but the opulence couldn't hide the heavy, oppressive silence of the mansion. The staff walked on eggshells. The bodyguards stared with cold suspicion. When she finally saw Leo, he was sitting in the middle of a massive, sterile playroom surrounded by hundreds of untouched, expensive toys. He looked up, his big brown eyes widening. For the first time, a tiny, fragile smile broke across his face. He stood up and ran to Sienna, burying his face in her legs. Her heart broke. Extortion or not, this little boy needed someone. For the first few weeks, Sienna dedicated herself entirely to Leo. She threw out the strict, militaristic schedules the previous nannies had left. She let him play in the mud in the heavily guarded gardens. She baked cookies with him, ignoring the disapproving glares of the private chef. She read to him until he fell asleep in her lap. Slowly, the color returned to Leo's cheeks. He began to laugh. Titus watched from a distance, standing in doorways, a silent, brooding phantom. He rarely spoke to Sienna, but she could feel his intense, burning gaze, tracking her every move. The tension between them was a physical thing, a dangerous mix of resentment, authority, and something she was terrified to name. But as Sienna settled into the rhythm of the house, she began to notice the cracks in the pristine facade. It was the locked doors at the end of the east hallway. It was the hushed, fearful whispers of the maids when they thought she wasn't listening. It was the way Carmine and the other men came in at all hours of the night, sometimes washing blood off their hands in the kitchen sink like it was motor oil. The official story was that Titus's wife, Isabella, had died in a tragic car accident on a rainy highway. Titus had supposedly been destroyed by it. But one rainy afternoon, while Leo was taking a nap, Sienna decided to wash his favorite stuffed bear, a ratty, worn-out thing he refused to let out of his sight. As she unzipped the back of the bear to remove the stuffing before washing it, something hard and metallic clattered into the laundry sink. Sienna froze. She reached down with trembling fingers and picked it up. It wasn't a toy part, it was a spent bullet casing. A Utexan May shell. Her blood ran cold. She looked at the bear. Why would a child hide a bullet casing in his favorite toy? Unless he had been there. You shouldn't go digging where you don't belong, Sienna. Sienna whipped around. Carmine was standing in the doorway of the laundry room, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his scarred face expressionless. The boss likes you, Carmine said softly, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. The kid likes you. Don't ruin a good thing by trying to play detective. Sienna backed up against the sink, her hand instinctively closing tight around the cold brass casing in her palm. The dark, terrifying reality of who she was living with and what really happened to Leo's mother was suddenly closing in on her. Sienna's fingers curled tight around the cold 9mm casing, pressing the brass into her palm before Carmine could see what she had unearthed from the child's favorite toy. She forced her breathing to steady, meeting the scarred enforcer's dead-eyed stare with a calmness she didn't feel. "I'm just doing the laundry, Carmine," Sienna stated, her voice remarkably even despite the frantic hammering against her ribs. "No detective work here." Carmine lingered for a long, suffocating moment. His dark eyes darted to the ratty stuffed bear resting on the granite counter. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "See that you keep it that way. The boss has enough headaches with the feds sniffing around the South Side ports. He doesn't need a civilian causing trouble inside his own house." When the heavy laundry room door finally clicked shut, Sienna collapsed against the washing machine, exhaling a shaky breath. She slipped the bullet casing deep into her apron pocket. The narrative Titus had fed the world a tragic, accidental car crash on a rainy stretch of Route 41 was a complete fabrication. Leo had been there. The little boy had seen something so horrific it shattered his mind and stole his voice. Over the next month, Sienna played her part perfectly. To the armed guards patrolling the estate, she was the quiet, obedient caregiver. To little Leo, she was the son. The boy transformed under her gentle care. The agonizing night terrors receded, replaced by quiet mornings painting in the solarium and afternoons building massive Lego towers. He still hadn't spoken a single word, but his laughter began to echo through the sterile, cavernous halls, bringing a strange, unfamiliar warmth to the Costa estate. And then there was Titus. The ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate was a phantom in his own home, but Sienna frequently caught him watching them. One evening, after putting a thoroughly exhausted Leo to bed, Sienna walked downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. The massive house was entirely dark, save for the ambient glow of the city skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She found Titus sitting at the marble island, a half-empty bottle of expensive scotch between him and a stack of heavily redacted legal documents. He looked utterly exhausted, the sharp, terrifying lines of his face softened by the shadows. "You're up late," Titus murmured, not looking up from a file bearing the seal of the district attorney. "So are you," Sienna replied softly. She didn't retreat. Instead, she poured a glass of water and boldly sat on the stool opposite him. Titus finally looked up, his dark, onyx eyes locked onto hers, stripping away her defenses. He smiled today. "When you pushed him on the swings, I haven't seen him smile like that since." His jaw tightened, refusing to finish the sentence. "Since his mother died?" Sienna pushed, her voice a careful whisper. A dark, dangerous storm brewed in Titus's eyes. He closed the file with a heavy snap. Isabella's death was complicated. Sienna thought of the cold brass casing hidden in her jewelry box upstairs. "Leo isn't just grieving, Titus. He's deeply traumatized. He flinches when doors slam. A simple car crash doesn't do that to a child." Titus stood up abruptly, the stool scraping harshly against the imported tile. He walked to the window, staring out at the floodlit grounds. "Isabella wasn't the saint the papers made her out to be," he finally admitted, his voice rough. "It was an arranged marriage, two powerful families merging. She hated me, but worst of all, she resented Leo for tying her to this life." Sienna's breath hitched. What happened? Titus turned back to face her, the vulnerability instantly replaced by lethal rage. "Isabella didn't die in a crash. She tried to run. She took $3 million from my private vault and tried to take Leo with her as a bargaining chip to ensure I wouldn't send my men after her. My crew caught up to her at an airfield in Rockford. She was meeting an associate of a rival syndicate, Thomas Valenti. She was selling my family's secrets to him. Titus's voice dropped to a dead, icy whisper. When my men cornered her, she pulled a weapon. A firefight broke out. Leo was strapped in the back seat. Isabella was killed in the crossfire by Valenti's men. Leo saw the mother who tormented him bleed out on the tarmac. That is the ghost haunting my son, Sienna. He looked at her, fully expecting her to run in terror. Instead, Sienna stood up, closed the distance between them, and gently placed her warm hand on his rigid forearm. "He's not haunted anymore," she whispered fiercely. "We just need more time." Titus raised a hand, his calloused knuckles lightly brushing against her cheek. But before he could speak, the shrill, deafening blare of the estate's perimeter alarms shattered the moment. The blare of the perimeter alarms violently shattered the fragile peace of the kitchen. Red emergency strobes washed the marble floors in crimson, and before Sienna could fully comprehend the noise, Titus had shoved her behind his broad frame. A heavy Glock 19 materialized in his grip. The kitchen doors violently swung open. Carmine charged in, his tailored suit jacket abandoned, a submachine gun strapped tightly across his chest. "Boss, it's a massive breach," Carmine shouted, his voice cutting through the deafening sirens. 3 armored SUVs just rammed the south gate. They're blowing right through the outer security detail. It's a coordinated hit. Titus's jaw tightened into stone. "Who?" "The Romanos." Carmine spat the name like venom. "Isabella's father. They figured out the truth about the Rockford airfield. They've come for blood, and they've come to take the air." Pure, unadulterated terror flashed in Titus's eyes, not for his own life, but for his son's. Leo. Sienna didn't wait for permission. "I'll get him," she screamed, already turning and sprinting toward the main staircase. "Sienna, stop!" Titus roared, but she was already gone. Outside, the pop, pop, pop of automatic gunfire erupted, echoing off the stone facade of the estate. The heavy front doors shuddered under a relentless assault. Sienna scrambled up the grand staircase, her lungs burning and adrenaline surging, completely drowning out her fear. She reached the east wing, sprinting down the long, shadowed hallway toward Leo's room. She threw open his door. The little boy was sitting up in bed, his hands clamped tightly over his ears, his face twisted in a silent scream. The deafening noise was dragging his fragile mind right back to the bloody tarmac where his mother had died. "Leo!" Sienna dove onto the mattress, wrapping him in a fierce, unbreakable embrace. "I've got you! Look at me, baby! I've got you!" Leo buried his face in her neck, trembling violently. Sienna grabbed his ratty stuffed bear, wrapped a thick down comforter around his small body, and scooped him up. She couldn't stay trapped in this room. She remembered Titus mentioning a reinforced panic room behind the ground floor library. She slipped out into the chaotic hallway, moving as fast as she could. Below, the sounds of warfare were horrifying. Men shouted in rapid-fire Italian. Glass shattered. The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted up the stairs. As she reached the top of the landing, a massive, bearded man in a tactical vest rounded the corner from the opposite stairwell. He wasn't one of Titus's guards. The hitman spotted Sienna and the boy, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. "Grandpa Romano sends his regards." The man sneered, raising his weapon directly at them. Sienna didn't freeze. She didn't beg for her life. A fierce maternal instinct exploded within her. She spun around, turning her back to the hitman, putting her own body entirely between the loaded gun and Leo. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the burning impact. Bang! The sound was deafening, but Sienna felt no pain. She opened her eyes and turned her head to see the hitman crumple backward down the stairs, a neat red hole right between his eyes. Standing at the bottom of the steps, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, was Titus. His face was a mask of unholy fury, streaked with blood and soot. "Get to the library!" Titus roared, already pivoting his weapon toward another attacker breaching the foyer. Sienna scrambled down the back servant stairs, holding Leo so tightly her arms ached. She fell into the library, slamming the heavy oak doors shut. She found the hidden panel behind the bookshelf, slammed her palm against the biometric scanner, and ushered Leo into the steel-reinforced safe room. For 30 agonizing minutes, they sat in the pitch black. Sienna rocked Leo, humming the lullaby she had sung at the restaurant, desperately trying to drown out the muffled sounds of the massacre outside. And then, the impossible happened. Leo pulled his face away from her shoulder. He looked up, his big brown eyes filled with tears but startlingly clear. He reached a tiny hand up and touched Sienna's cheek. "Mama," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, but the word rang through the dark room like a bell. Sienna burst into tears, pulling him tight. "I'm right here, sweetie." An hour later, the heavy steel door clicked open. Titus stood in the doorway, his suit ruined and bleeding from a grazed shoulder, but the estate behind him was dead silent. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, pulling both Sienna and Leo into a desperate, crushing embrace. "It's over," Titus breathed. "The Romanos walked into a slaughter. Hard karma for trying to take what belongs to me." 6 months later, Sienna was sitting in the sunlit gardens of the estate, watching Leo laugh hysterically as he chased a golden retriever puppy. Titus walked out onto the patio, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He sat beside her, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "Sterling called me today begging for his job back," Titus mentioned casually. "I told him to talk to the new owner." He placed the paper in her lap. It was the deed to Il Sapor, legally transferred into Sienna's name. "Titus," she started, shocked. "You saved my son, Sienna. You walked into the darkness and brought us back to the light," he said, his dark eyes filled with absolute devotion. "The restaurant is yours. My life is yours." Sienna looked out at Leo, then back at the dangerous, powerful man beside her. "I'm exactly where I belong," she whispered, leaning in to capture his lips. The waitress had walked into the lion's den to comfort a crying child, and in doing so, she hadn't just tamed the Mafia boss, she had become the undisputed queen of the empire. Did this story of unexpected love, dark family secrets, and hard karma keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved seeing Sienna step up to protect Leo and the shocking twists of the Costa family, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next thrilling true life drama.